It's so great to be with all you guys. I feel like I've come back home in my techie world to be with everybody. But what I want to talk about today, I'm going to flip through really fast a lot of images and talk through, let's call it strategically tactical, things that are, I think, roots. And we have felt like roots in the problems that we're working on. And many people in this room are already addressing some of those in really interesting ways, but also really interesting, promising essence of solutions that are coming. And I want to talk through some of those. And really, if you think about my particular job as the Chief Technology Officer, it's a job to help harness the power of data, innovation, and technology on behalf of the American people. And you're working with the president and his team to do that. When we think about that, we really think a lot about unlocking talent. Because the more talent that applies it to self to what it would do, the more we solve more and more problems. And so really think about this sort of hyper-enablement of everyone and using these technologies in new ways, and I think many people in the room really resonate with that. The president was in Pittsburgh recently for the Frontiers Conference. Many people may have seen the Wired magazine issue that he was editing, and he focused on 5 frontiers. And you think about these are the most promising, exciting things that are happening, right? Whether on the first one, kind of personal frontiers, personalized medicine and cancer moonshot and brain initiative and families and personalized learning, these kinds of topics that we have so much opportunity for. Smart cities and local opportunities, but thinking more broadly, not just the cities and the plumbing layer, which is important and exciting and we're working on, but also the humans. What are we doing about justice? What are we doing about economic opportunity and inclusion? And how are we moving that frontier forward together in interesting ways? And who has promising things there? The third one was around national frontiers, and he wanted to focus on artificial intelligence. And so you can see in some of the pictures, Dennis McDonough, who's the chief of staff here, was hosting really a policy conversation on stage with various AI leaders. One of the big topics is related to us, which is how are we using machine learning and AI for the harder problems in the world around equality and justice and those pieces of this. And one of the things that's interesting to notice is that the World Bank's report for the year of 2015 was called Digital Dividends. And their thesis is the countries that are bothering to do things like machine learning and AI and high-end advanced data work, not only in the equivalent of their NASAs and their NIHs, but also with their departments of labor and housing and urban development and all those pieces, and really digital dividends are creating much more equality within their societies. We're seeing that in Estonia and in Singapore and other places. And so thinking about the opportunities of big data and AI for the problems we're on and getting to those sooner rather than waiting. The fourth one was around global climate and energy, and the fifth was about space. And it's interesting to tie the space one with the local, because Raj Chetty was on stage there also, and he's with Sandra Moore here. They were talking about data, and she was talking about how useful that data would be for working on problems with some of the single mothers in St. Louis that she's working with. It's this idea of design with in the data. And one of the things that's so interesting about Raj's data is he looked at whether location, one of his research looking at location, rather location mattered if you're in deep poverty, and Baltimore ended up being one of the poorest places, one of the worst places for mobility for poorer youth. And yet, if you think about space, that's where some of the Pluto team is. So the actual team from the United States that went to Pluto is in Baltimore. Now, how can it be that within 5 miles are some of the poorest youth and the Pluto team? And why don't we have an internship for those youth in the Pluto team? What are we doing to barn raise? It's not like we need any more research. We're the richest thing in the world, the US federal government, the United States, right? How do we use all the resources we have in a new barn-raising way? We're including everyone. And how do we use the technologies? And Frontiers was really about that. And it comes down to much of this. Like, here are these amazing kids, the American kids. They're in for science fair. We got to do a lot of science fairs. This particular conversation was fun. The president was asking how they made this page-turning robot. They said, we had a brainstorming. And you did. And then what did you do? We built a prototype. You know, and to what Steve was just talking about on stage, what if every kid in kindergarten or first grade was building prototypes and having these kinds of experiences, and it didn't rather matter whether it was math class or reading class, it's a page-turning robot, and we're gonna make things better, and then we go into how the physics works behind it, right? So it's this kind of hope, but one of the challenges is what happens from this moment. So I wanna talk about media. This is an amazing data set that some people at polygraph.cool audited. They looked at film. When we watch film, What do we see? This is gender divide. So on the bottom corners here, this is children's TV. Blue is boys' lines or men's lines. Red is women's lines. So all day long, our children learn that boys and men speak and girls don't. And then when we grow up, this is 2,000 screenplays. It's amazing when you see it. We know media is biased, but wow. We didn't mean to do that to those little girls, but that's what happens to them. And so I pulled this up. This is the document from Seneca Falls that they ratified. Most people don't know them, but the bottom line here, the last of the 16 sentiments talks about destroying confidence. So I actually think one of the things that we really need to be looking at is how are we working on confidence of everybody so that they will opt themselves into the kinds of world that we have. What are we doing in media? This is the Macintosh team that Steve Jobs worked with. I got to work with them on smartphones, and Joanna Hoffman, product manager, Susan Kerr down here, all the graphics we see, they haven't been in the movies. Joanna was finally in one of them, but it's not just omission of the history, but it's also microaggression. Joanna came out of the movie, and her son said, "Mom, did you really iron Steve Jobs' shirt?" And Joanna said, she's from Eastern Europe. She's a physics grad from MIT. She's like, "Jeremy, I never ironed a shirt in my life except once for you." But why did the writers write that? What is it in our stereotypes? Ida B. Wells, protesting the Chicago World's Fair with Frederick Douglass at the turn of last century to ask for African-American inventors to be able to display, African-American solutions to be on display. They tried everything. I just reread their papers. Everything they could to get in, they couldn't get in. We are in the same place with tech. Right? So what are we doing? What are we doing? So we got to get past that. Josephine invented the dishwasher. Her company is KitchenAid, but all we celebrate for her is this Romanian stamp. So we have to know the past to know the future, because we have to know that Katherine Johnson did calculate the trajectories for the Apollo mission, and that an African-American woman who was born 2 years before the vote is an elite mathematician at that level. Taraji Henson, who's playing her in the film, was crying, saying, "I didn't know that. I could have been a scientist." So Grace Hopper's stuff is in boxes, but the president just gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She is, as the president said, right is flight, Edison is light, Grace is code. She invented coding languages, and we have a space for her we could hang on the American History Museum. This is, of course, the Duchess of Cambridge. This photo is interesting because right now, to the National Computing Museum and Bletchley Park, it's 25-1, boy visitors to girl visitors. So in the UK, children are being programmed that the boys do computers and the girls don't, and yet Kate's great aunt and grandmother were codebreakers at Bletchley Park, saving 11 million lives and shortening the war by 2 years. These are 90-year-old code-breaking mathematical women. So we're working on this. We're working on telling the stories and bringing them back. We're working on the data of diversity. We know that diversity is a prosperity agenda. Tom Khalil's here. We just announced, you can find up on the websites a whole bunch of work about entrepreneurship that we've been doing to expand inclusivity. We also launched this grid that really focuses on things you can do right now to lift the floor of our minimum practice of inclusion. Leadership can do, advancement work, hiring work, ecosystem work, tech inclusion pledges. We've got Hack the Pay Gap with Secretary Pritzker. We can really use our code to really see the data and get out of the mess that we're in. We can use computer science for all. Tom often calls these the all hands on decks, with the president, so that it takes an ecosystem, get coding into all of our schools. But there really are 13-year-olds who can just be like Mark Zuckerberg and do their thing. Right? These girls are doing gaming, as well as Kimura's app up there listens to the room for domestic violence and gives you the option to call the police. There's hackathons, but they're secret. They're in parts of the city, so we have to figure out how do we invite everyone to the National Day of Civic Hacking and work on the things they would love to work on. We've been talking during this session about police data initiative and data-driven justice. This is Grace. She's a 10th grader, now 11th grader, teaching the police chief in New Orleans how to code so she can be part of something that she's passionately trying to solve in our country, urgent issues around justice, be part of solution making as a high schooler, so we can think about flipping the model and including those design with. All the challenges around mental health and substance abuse disorder that are driving the prison populations beyond what our society wants, but really getting into the data like in Camden, where you can realize you have these super utilizers that you can help them more. These guys are now spending a fraction of the money solving the problem. Same thing with Miami-Dade. Huge problems that they had with just a handful of people. They were able to rethink that with a stabilization unit in the hospital, and now using that idea this stabilization unit so the police and 911 have somewhere else to bring someone in addition to jail or the ER, that's a great solution. So we call that scout and scale. You find something amazing like this, let's tell everyone. And now we have a community of practice. Steve was talking about this peer-to-peer learning function. Why don't we use the internet? We have it. Let's use it fast. Now we have biweekly calls, 127 jurisdictions. They're all across the country. Now talking to each other and cross-sharing this. We can accelerate, and we've got a lot of data problems. And so tech folks can scrub in locally and then cross-share nationally to debug this problem together. We're doing this stuff with refugees. This is an amazing response from the business community to bring not only money and support, but also what they're capable of doing, like Airbnb adding housing into the mix. What's your capacity? What can you give with your skills and with your products? Tech Hire, which is an incredible idea to just lift an ecosystem. It just asks employers to look at alternative hiring, boot camps. It takes boot camps and makes sure they're available and asks workforce development to help mix that together. And we're seeing Atlanta, Albuquerque, St. Louis just rising and filling these 600,000 tech jobs that we have open. They pay 50% more than the average American salary. So you can use ecosystem thinking, and now those 51 plus communities are talking to each other and cross-sharing, and we can accelerate people into the 21st century jobs. One of my favorite ones that was on stage at the local Frontiers Conference is the BitSource team, Justin Hall. This is coal to code. This is rural Kentucky, former coal miners. Now they had 90 people apply. They took the first cohort of 10. They now have a business of coders who are doing e-commerce locally and doing all kinds of code work. And the first thing they had to do was to work on self-confidence. Because people felt like, well, we can't do that scary thing because we have stereotypes that there's tech people and not tech people. And so we have to break out of that. And what they did with these guys is like, you guys are engineers, you're underground. You happen to be covered with coal and dirt, but you know how to debug anything, so let's go. And they're doing it. This is a great example of Dame Steve Shirley in the 60s created freelance programmers. We have a lot of stay-at-home workers doing care. They have some part-time. She'd created that. They used to play cassette tapes of typing so people on the phone wouldn't hear babies crying. She floated her company. It's a $3 billion company, 70 millionaires, almost all women coders. So we can do that kind of thing. It's existed before. And we can get the kids into this fun STEM. Like it feels like gym and art and PE, and they learn grit and they do that kind of work. And we can also include them. This is a chief science officer group of cohort from Arizona. So we saw the solution where they're like, why don't we scrub the kids into helping us? They elect these kids, totally diverse, and they're evangelists for STEM, just like a treasurer or a school president, totally works. We can use our national labs as a footprint. Now we have thousands of kids going into the labs every February on Black History Month, Women's History Month, to have an experience of a field trip and meet people who do these amazing things and understand what this is for and see their own community, how they could be powerful like this. Use our libraries, use our ag centers. This is an AI team. We could use artificial intelligence. In this case, they're working on first and second grade learning. And so they have an avatar working interactively with you. So it's a very diverse team who wanted to work on that problem and scrubbed in with AI. So thinking more expansively that way. The last thing I wanted to touch on is really, how do we use these amazing institutions of government? I had no plan originally to go to government. And it's been amazing to find extraordinary colleagues. And I got to give the commencement at MIT, and I told them, you guys need to go 2 places. One, where there's tons of us, and we'll advance the field like crazy, like Silicon Valley, but you also need to come into government where there's less of us. You know, Jen Palka's here, who pioneered so much of this with Code for America, because we're rare there, but it is crazy. Why should we don't say lawyers and government. We don't say economists and government. We shouldn't say techies and government. We should be in our government, because our country will be as good as what we make. And so it's a cross-functional thing. And so the president's really pulling people in. We have over 400 people already there. And Todd Park will talk this afternoon a little bit more about what folks have been up to. But everything from inclusivity and engagement platforms, analytics on websites for the government, really releasing data. We released 200,000 data sets for the president's leadership. So this is an example of college data for people to be able to know about the costs. You know, how are we helping our students with the costs of student loans? And so what kind of data should they have before they make these decisions? So this was great because it was a $12 million project that had spent $9 and wasn't resulting in anything. They canceled it. And they quickly, in a couple months, built a bunch of APIs and a reference design on top of it and launched. And now this data is starting to surface in search and other places. Same with Opportunity Project that Aidan will talk a little more about. But Census, who's more big data than Census? Right? So Census is big data. They now have an innovation lab right next to the cafeteria. And they've had over 400 projects go through there. It feels much more like a tech incubator in the Census team. It's a fun place to work. And so they're making software developer kits for cities, packaging up those data sets, packaging up data sets for Opportunity, thinking through how do you design for 100%? So we can use our government as one of the greatest lifts for getting people out of poverty, leveraging these data sets, and then having everyone building in open ecosystems on top of that for what they might be passionate about delivering, including the high school kids. One of my favorite things the CTO of Los Angeles has done is she took all the different data sets that she could and went into UCLA, USC, all the community colleges, different schools, and started adding city data sets to the curriculum. So students now might be hacking on the zoo data, the garbage data, and they're getting a civic mindset with a techie background. And so that city is lifting in really interesting ways. We could do that across the whole country. Tech people into policy. Why don't we have some of the people who have been working on self-driving cars or UAV tech be in the room when we're deciding policy? Because we have them in our country. So we call it TQ, like IQ in the room. President and Chief of Staff created a thing called the Tech Policy Task Force, which allows us to have technical conversations at the principal level and feed in, and so things that have resulted like the open source policy that the government has. This is one of my favorites, which is where the teams at Health and Human Services were working on new policy for quality payments, but instead of launching the policy final and then building websites and then having doctors work on them, they did it all at the same time and kept prototyping with each other. So they actually prototyped the language. They'd make a website, they'd interact with doctors, and then they'd say, oh, we didn't mean that, and then they'd go back and fix the language and go back around. And it was really an amazing agile experience. And so the quality of what the doctors and ultimately patients and the industry will receive will be so much greater. So this is not just the United States. It's happening all over the world, and the Open Government Partnership will be meeting next week. And it's 70 countries, hundreds of civil society organizations, and techies. And it's a new platform where people are really accelerating. There's an open code base. There's a hackathon that the French team has pulled together. Sometimes we tease them, they should call it Code Civil, like the civil code from Napoleon, but the actual code. And so it's starting to really happen. And it's exciting, and having worked on the beginning of the internet and the beginning of smartphones, it really is the beginning of digital, open, data-driven government. And we will be able to take these extraordinary budgets and start to shift them into the kind of solution making that the sharing economies and the collaboration of all of us would be able to achieve with that kind of extraordinary resource if we can get it in the right position. The Sustainable Development Goals, I just sort of talk a little bit about that because they are this incredible framework that the United Nations teams have given us to really think about the major problems in the world. They're very interrelated. What we were able to do was bring a new methodology into that and have a solution summit within an hour of ratification. And so we asked the UN, why don't you put up a form and say, you've got these goals, we're about to ratify. Anybody out there got solutions in progress that you would want to do like a mini TED Talk for 3 minutes, 1 hour of ratification? Got 800 submissions from the world, from 100 countries. Extraordinary things people are doing, and so you can think then like a venture catalyst, think venture capital, but catalyze these people. And whether it was a team this year that was using the blockchain to help with land records, in this case in Ghana, because Noah's house actually says this house is not for sale, written on his house, because people will come sell it because the land records aren't usable. And so instead, he can use the blockchain. And so he's a University of Michigan grad working with his roommate to bring this new idea. That's a very cool application. Over here, the maker movement, the incredible maker movement that builds so much confidence. And we can have that not only in our libraries, in our schools, in our egg centers. These people are building one floating in the Amazon. So what would happen when the kids run off the dock into like a home ec art lab kind of shop place? What would they make? What would they invent? And what kind of confidence? Back to confidence, would they have to impact their world and lift their community and bring the solutions that in this case would probably be very bio-informed. Up here, there's a group flying drones to plant 1 billion trees a year. There's a group in Uganda that there's no representation for prisoners, pretty much. And so they're teaching law in prison and thousands of people getting themselves out of jail. including a woman who got herself off death row and changed the law so it's no longer capital punishment from her cell. So just extraordinary things that people would do. So circling back to the frontiers world, there's so many frontiers, but the coolest frontier is to do these with everybody on the topics that they would love to work on. And that's the kind of world, given the internet that we've built and the capabilities that we have, that really we have the opportunity to make happen. So I'll end with this point, which is the Carnegie Mellon folks at Pittsburgh, they say the heart is in the work. And when my boys were in 3rd grade, they got to have one of the best master teachers ever. And the biggest thing in her room, it says, in effort, there's joy. And so how is it that we can get everybody to be in on making and doing and creating all together? And the way I sometimes think about this is I had the chance to go with Mary and Steve Grove, who are here, to Afghanistan when I was working in Silicon Valley. And we met one of the guys doing security. And he said that every time they flew into Kandahar, this kid ran out of the house and would lay on top of his roof. And they thought maybe he likes airplanes, but it's his story. So this one guy went by the house one day. And he stopped and he talked to the kids, and he found out the little boy was running out of his house to lie on the solar panel to make sure it didn't crack. So what would he and his other Afghan colleague kids do if we could give them the maker-like tools that they deserve and the empowerment and the network and each other and all of us? That's a world I want to live in. So thank you so much for being here, and regards from the president.